Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thanks so much for joining us today. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Gilborn from the University of Birmingham. Thanks for being able to join us today, Sarah.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So before we get to your really exciting new article that I want to talk about a bit, could you just tell the listeners, we haven't had a guest from the University of Birmingham. What is that institution like? What is your own professional background? What do you teach? Anything that would be helpful context for our listeners, please.
Great. Yeah, no problem. So I'm at the University of Birmingham. It's a pretty big university in the UK. I think it's around 30,000 students, something like that. We have a mix of undergrads, postgrads, doctoral, PhD students. It's got quite a nice big campus. I'm still quite new to the university, actually, so still enjoying exploring it myself. So I teach psychology at that university. I'm actually, the university is split into smaller colleges, and then within the colleges we have schools. So I'm actually in the School of Education, and I teach on the course that's called Psychology in Education, but we do also have a School of Psychology, and some of the modules within courses are shared across them. So yes, I'm in the School of Education teaching psychology. Within that course, I teach critical psychology and social psychology. And I'm a critical psychologist. I did a psychology undergraduate degree and then went on to do a PhD research piece in critical psychology. And if you're not familiar with critical psychology and kind of what that is, it's kind of turning the lens back onto psychology as a discipline itself. So kind of thinking critically about how psychology works, how it makes sense of social issues. In my case, particularly looking at how it makes sense of marginalization, social injustice, and thinking critically about how psychology works and the kind of knowledges that are constructed through it. So that's kind of what critical psychology is, and a bit of my background too.
Thank you very much. Critical psychology is a totally new term to me as it being a discipline, and sounds incredibly helpful because the discipline is right now in a time, right? The APA just issued an apology statement around racism. That sounds like it would be consistent with the kinds of things that your field is interested in. So, and now this also helps me understand some context of the paper I read, which has in the title Intensely White, referring to the psychology curriculum. So could you tell us a little bit about that paper, and then we'll kind of get into talking about the implications of it and what we might be doing about it, please?
Sure. Yeah, I think critical psychology is helpful for helping to address, some of the things that the APA mentioned in that apology, because it gives us tools that we can use to kind of look beyond the surface and look at how racism might be existent in the curriculum in ways that to some people might appear less, obvious and things like that. And that's really what we wanted to do with this paper. So the paper reports on analysis of focus groups that we did with 22 students of colour at a UK university. So we used focus groups, and we wanted to talk to the students about the white curriculum, how it's experienced, how it's understood by students, and kind of drawing on the idea of students, particularly students who experience racism, having a better understanding of the more, so-called subtle ways that racism might appear in the curriculum that might be completely invisible to lecturers and researchers and the people who are writing the curricula. So, we kind of got some analysis from that about in what ways the curriculum is white. So probably unsurprisingly, the participants were telling us that it was very white. Examples, theories, case studies tended to be from white researchers with white participants and based on very white experiences and ways of looking at the world. But then related to that, we got some examples of how people of colour, people in the global south are kind of, when they are mentioned, inherently pathologized in the curriculum, presented in very racist ways, or when they're not presented at all, there's this kind of normalized absence, as Anne Phoenix refers to it as, this kind of normalized absence, pathologized presence of people of color in the curriculum. We also kind of talked about how, or the participants talked about how, when there are issues of diversity and covering issues of inequality in the curriculum, it tends to be in option modules, things that people who already have an interest in it can choose to take as a kind of add-on to the core things that they have to learn. And in that sense, understanding diversity is not being treated as a core element of developing effective psychologists and practitioners. So yeah, we looked at kind of how, or the participants talked to us about how when things like racism are talked about in the curriculum, it's often not given much space, or people can sometimes mention that, a founding father of psychology was quite racist, and they'll mention that and then move on. And there's kind of no space to interrogate that or to think about what role that racism has played in how we still understand the topics that are informed by those early theorists. So we really got, the participants in this research really illuminated some of the very systemic ways in which the psychology curriculum is racist and is harmful, and in ways that I think would be kind of invisible to particularly white lecturers who ourselves have gone through probably a very white psychology curriculum. So it's easy to not notice this or to not really think critically about it. So some really important things coming up in this paper, I think, that go beyond the more commonly talked about issues of needing to have more Black authors, for example, but actually getting more into what do we think we know in psychology, who's privileged by that, who's either ignored by it or inherently pathologized by it. And yeah, it kind of has some really important things to say about psychology curriculum, but also about psychology or psychological knowledge more broadly, and how that systemically can uphold racism in society. So that's a bit of an overview of what is a longer paper than I can summarize briefly.
Yes, well, thank you. And I will put a link to the DOI in the show notes. So maybe I'll start with a practical way of going about this. You teach social psych. So how do you teach social psych that might be informed or is going to be changed from this? Because I think you'd like that. There's stereotypes. I haven't taken social psych since 1997, but my understanding, and I don't teach intro, right? So it's really been a while. And I think stereotypes comes in there, conformity, group processes. It's like, what are you doing in social psych to deal with this?
Yeah, so each topic in social psychology, I've always involved, as well as teaching the kind of key theories and what the key theories in social psychology are, I kind of place just as much of an importance on critically evaluating those theories as presenting them. And when I say critically evaluating, importantly, I don't mean just validity and reliability, and not even just, who was this theory or what kind of people was this theory originally based on. But again, going deeper than that and thinking about who might be implicated in this theory in different ways. And if we talk about conformity in certain ways, for example, what groups of people might we be pathologizing in how we talk about conformity? So there's a very common way of talking about that topic in terms of comparing collectivist cultures and individualist cultures. And that in itself is a very limiting way of talking about the world, and how conformity might look different in different places and across different spaces. But that can be a conversation that arises when we teach social psychology that may not always be given appropriate kind of thought and exploration to the implications of those discussions. As you mentioned, prejudice as well. And this is a really important one to me because, and I think it's also perhaps for me, it's kind of one of the more obvious things that's more easy, or that's easier to evaluate in social psychology, because social psychology tends to argue that prejudice is faulty thinking. It exists within an individual's mind. So prejudice is something that individuals do or think, or a way in which they behave. And there's also kind of an implication with a lot of theories on prejudice that all groups of people experience that prejudice in the same way. So, for example, a man would be just as harmed by, prejudice about being a man as a woman would be harmed by prejudice about being a woman. And it's the same when it comes to racism. So it kind of doesn't acknowledge the power differentials in those kinds of prejudice, but it also completely fails to recognize how racism, for example, is beyond individual actions. It doesn't only exist in the minds of individuals. And when people experience racism, it's not only, crude words or actions from other individuals. It can be embedded into the, daily workings of an organization or a curriculum even. And if we think of racism only as being this individual, faulty thought process, which is what social psychology typically tends to think of it as, we're really not understanding the many ways that racism does operate in society. And that's a really good example, I think, in social psychology of where this can be evaluated. So kind of going beyond the individualistic focus and thinking about how else racism exists. So I think there's two ways of doing it there. That one is like a very clear example of how racism itself is actually understood in social psychology and evaluating that understanding. But then theories in social psychology, like the conformity one and any of the theories really, thinking about how those theories came about, what ideas are they informed by, and, are they quietly, maybe not always explicitly, but are they constructing, for example, Western cultures as more rational? And with the example of conformity, are they perhaps constructing collectivist cultures as irrational or less psychologically healthy? What are the implications of these theories, and how do they how are different people implicated by them, essentially? So that's how I approach that module, really. It's kind of the sessions I deliver are almost half and half in terms of what is the theory, what do we know about this, what research is it based on, and then engaging with critical research on that theory and using that to inform the session and inform how students can evaluate that theory. And again, like not just in terms of the validity of the studies that kind of help to form it, but what are the implications of this theory and what might we think it's telling us about people that might be implicating people in different ways.
Thank you. That's very helpful and gives me a lot to think about in the structure of my own classes. So do you have a recommendation, and I get it if you don't, for someone that wants to dip their toes into this? I think I've started to feel a little more sensitive about some of what you just said, right? The holding up a superior, a rational approach to knowing, right? A scientific method approach to knowing. Do you have a starter place for people that might want to start putting this in their classes? Because I'm predicting that although I would have a concern that this is opening the door of saying, well, I don't believe anything you say, And because everything you say also has a critique to it. So why can't I just use my opinion? And I still want students to use research and think critically. So maybe answer that question instead. How do you think about those concerns when you're trying to convince people that still would be better than allowing the status quo, which we know is seeped in racism and sexism and heteronormativity for a long time, right? Lots of ways.
Yeah, I do encourage students to think critically about what it is that they're learning, and not in the sense of, everything's fake, nothing's real and we can't prove anything, but just, I think be critical about what it is that you're learning and look for alternative ways of understanding it, alternative explanations and alternative research. And thankfully, I haven't had any students sort of say that and say, well, if this can be critiqued, then why can't I just give my opinion? But I think I think the more that students are learning what the core theories are and also looking at different ways of understanding it and critiques of it, then the more if you know a bit of two different ways of understanding it, you can decide which way it is that you feel offers a good explanation or what you think is worth exploring more. And I hope that when people engage with critical psychology, and I know that for a lot of students, when they first do, it kind of feels like this whole new world being opened up, because it can be challenging to a lot of kind of taken for granted assumptions in psychology that have been around for decades. And the more that we engage with that kind of critical side of psychology, it just opens doors. And I think it helps us to deepen our understanding of the topics that we're learning about. I know, so developmental psychologists, for example, who are developmental psychologists, wouldn't refer to themselves as critical developmental psychologists, but have begun engaging with critical literature and just feel like it has helped to make them, to deepen their understanding and to think in more detail about the theories that are taken for granted. And, it kind of opens doors even in terms of research, because we might be operating from, particular paradigms or taken for granted assumptions. But if we engage more with critical psychology, it gives us space to go back to those kind of assumptions and theories and think more critically about them and start to investigate them in different ways, think about the different ways in which they work. So I think it's really about broadening our minds and broadening our understanding. And I think it's a positive thing. And there's always more that we could learn, and we're never going to know everything. But I think for everyone, including critical psychologists, stepping outside of your kind of comfort zone and exploring other topics and other ways of investigating the topics that you're interested in can be exciting. And if not necessarily exciting, can definitely be useful and just interesting to find out what more is there to what you know than you think you know.
I'm totally sold, right? And I think that's
nice.
It's not criticism just for the sake of criticism. We're supposed to be trying to find truth. And if part of what we thought was true was because we were only looking at partial information, it's super important that we figure out the rest of it, right? Or if we decide to come down on it, that we're like, no, I think this really does work. I won't lie. Like, I felt some level of relief when I saw how cognitive, some basic memory findings seem to be replicating. I was like, oh, phew, thank goodness, right? At least we're not in trouble right now. But instead of having that lens, I think it should be, well, we probably are in trouble for some other things, right? So where aren't we looking for where we're making the steps? So this is great. And I hope people read the paper and think about it. I always like to leave when I can some space for our guests that may have other things they want to tell people about that I don't know, right? I don't know everything. And I know even less about, right? Because we just met for the first time last week to talk about this recording. So Sarah, is there anything else you would like listeners to be thinking about this or about anything else about teaching?
Sure. I would it would be useful for me to kind of actually give a suggestion as to if people are teaching a course on a particular area of psychology, whether it's social or, cognitive or anything like that. If this is something that you want to explore in your own time and include in your own kind of teaching, often you can get kind of like edited handbooks or edited collections of critical psychologists who are talking about particular subjects or theories. So there's two at the minute that are always my go-to for the modules that I teach. For social psychology, the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Social Psychology. I've made it I like making a book my kind of recommended reading each week for the course, because I like students to be able to go to one resource and have it all be there. And in the case of social psychology, that book has literally a chapter dedicated to kind of each of the main areas in social psychology. So prejudice and discrimination, conformity, group processes. It's very perfect. So when I'm preparing a session, I'll get, a key social psychology textbook, which tend probably predictably not to include a whole lot of critical content. It's just, these are the theories, here's the research done. I'll get that, I'll use that, and I'll put together the kind of core content on the theory that we're tackling that week. And then I'll go and look at this handbook and I'll get the chapter on that. And from that, I'll pull out critical evaluations that we can explore. I know that there's a few of those, or at least this one that I use all the time for social psychology, but there are critical resources on all the different areas of psychology that I think people would find really useful as a jumping off point if this is something you wanted to do. So edited collections, I think can be easier to use as a kind of jumping off point if you're just starting out kind of engaging critically with your area. Once you've found a few authors that seem to have some useful stuff to say about it, obviously go and look at their work and kind of explore in a bit more detail. But I would recommend having a look at kind of critical psychology collections if people do want to explore this more, because they can be a really useful starting point for engaging in this kind of critical engagement with your area.
Okay. I'm going to leave this call and go Google for a handbook of critical cognitive psychology. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. I've been talking with Dr. Sarah Gilborn from the University of Birmingham. Take care.
Thank you.
Listeners, did today's episode make you realize you have a question you would like someone to answer? I would be happy to take it into consideration and find a guest that can help. But what I need you to do is head over to our Google form at bit.ly/AskPsychSessions.